The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 13, 1979. What the wind carried down from Deadfall Ridge that night would haunt Crooked Creek Valley for generations. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist clings to ridge lines like smoke from forgotten fires, 7 families once called the most isolated hollows home. Their secrets weren't just buried with the dead. They walked among the living, passed down through bloodlines that should have ended decades ago. The smell of wet limestone and rotting leaves fills your nostrils as you wind through these forgotten valleys. The sound of water dripping from cave mouths echoes off canyon walls. The texture of moss-covered stones crumbles beneath your feet as you follow paths that mapmakers deliberately omitted from official surveys. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed entire bloodlines, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. These mountains have a way of making everywhere else feel safer by comparison. If you're ready to uncover what happens when isolation breeds something worse than madness, hit that like button and subscribe, because some family trees grow roots in soil that should never see daylight. Our story begins with Eudora Wycliffe, the county clerk who kept meticulous records of births, deaths, and disappearances in Harlan County from 1943 to 1981. Her ledgers, discovered in a sealed vault beneath the courthouse after her death, contained entries that defied explanation. Names of children born to parents who had been dead for years. Death certificates filed decades before the recorded date of death. Marriage licenses between family members whose bloodlines traced back to the same corrupted source. From Eudora's personal journal, dated March 7, 1962. The Pembroke boy came again today. Same hollow eyes as his grandfather. Same questions about the sealed records. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some names shouldn't be spoken. Roland Pembroke had been asking those questions since 1958, when he inherited his family's mining claim deep in Devil's Fork Hollow. The claim came with a warning, scrawled in his grandfather's hand. What sleeps in the deep shafts must never wake. Roland thought it was the ramblings of a man, driven mad by coal dust and isolation. He was wrong. The Pembroke mining operation had been extracting something far more valuable than coal from those mountain depths. Something that 7 families had been protecting, cultivating, and feeding for over a century. The ledgers showed a pattern. Every 13 years, the same 7 surnames appeared in death records, always in October, always during the new moon. But 1979 was different. That year, the pattern broke. Instead of the usual 7 deaths, there were none. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a scream. County records show that between October 13th and Halloween night, 43 people simply vanished from their homes in the hollow. No signs of struggle, no packed belongings, just empty houses with meals still warm on kitchen tables. The only witness was Sophronia Litchfield, the local postmistress who lived at the mouth of Devil's Fork Hollow. She watched from her porch as shadows moved between the houses after midnight, shadows that walked upright but cast no reflection in the creek water below. Sophronia's statement to Sheriff Carroll, dated November 1st, 1979. They came down from the old mine like smoke given form, moved house to house, calling names I ain't heard, spoke in 20 years, names that should have died with their owners. Sheriff Everett Carroll buried that statement in his personal files. He had reasons to keep certain truths from reaching the outside world. His own family name appeared in Eudora's sealed records, dating back to the founding of the settlement in 1857. The Carrows weren't just law enforcement in these mountains, they were gatekeepers. What had the 7 families been guarding in those deep mountain hollows? What force required such careful cultivation, such deliberate isolation? The answer lay buried beneath generations of silence, protected by a conspiracy that stretched from the courthouse to the church, from the general store to the schoolhouse. Every institution in the valley served the same hidden purpose. The children born in these hollows weren't raised, they were prepared. The elderly didn't die of natural causes, they were offered. The missing weren't lost, they were chosen. But what happens when a system built on sacrifice suddenly has no willing participants left to feed it? What emerges from the deep places when the old contracts are broken? The pickaxe hit bone on Roland Pembroke's third strike into the new vein, 600 feet below Devil's Fork Hollow. The sound it made wasn't the clean crack of limestone. It was wet, organic, like splitting green wood. What Roland unearthed in those depths would explain why his family's mining operation had been the most profitable in eastern Kentucky for 3 generations. Despite never shipping a single ton of coal, the air in the deep shafts carried the metallic tang of iron and something sweeter like honey left too long in the sun. Water dripped steadily from calcified formations that resembled rib cages more than stalactites. The tunnel walls felt warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no geological process taught in any textbook. Roland's grandfather had warned him about the deep shafts for good reason. The Pembroke family wasn't mining coal. They were harvesting something far more ancient, something that had been growing in the mountain's belly since before the Cherokee walked these ridges. From the Pembroke Mining Company logs, dated September 21st, 1979, Vein 7 shows unprecedented growth. Specimens exhibit characteristics inconsistent with known mineral formations. Recommend immediate cessation of extraction pending consultation with the other families. But Roland didn't stop digging. 3 weeks before the October 13th incident, he broke through into a chamber that had been sealed for over a century. What he found there sent him straight to Mercy Pendleton's doorstep, carrying samples wrapped in oilcloth and questions that threatened to unravel everything the 7 families had worked to contain. Mercy Pendleton ran the mountain's only medical practice from a converted farmhouse on Widow's Peak. Her credentials came from no university that kept records, but her knowledge of anatomy, both human and otherwise, was unmatched in 3 counties. The locals called her a healer. The families knew her true purpose. She had been expecting Roland's visit. Her examination room smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs that didn't grow in any garden. Medical instruments hung from hooks along the walls, scalpels, forceps, and other tools whose purposes weren't taught in conventional medical schools. Glass jars lined the shelves, their contents preserved in amber fluid that reflected light like liquid gold. "You opened Chamber 7, Mercy said before Roland could speak. Her voice carried the flat certainty of a woman who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "I can smell it on you." The samples Roland had brought weren't minerals at all. Under Mercy's microscope, they revealed a cellular structure that defied classification. Part plant, part fungus, part something else entirely. They pulsed with their own internal light and showed signs of intelligence responding to stimuli, growing toward heat sources, retreating from certain chemical compounds. Mercy's medical journal, entry dated September 24th, 1979. Patient RP exhibits symptoms consistent with exposure to specimen type 7. Cellular changes evident in blood work. Recommend immediate quarantine and consultation with AG regarding historical precedents. The families had been feeding this thing for generations. Ambrose Grimshaw, the valley's undertaker, had been providing the sustenance it required. His funeral parlor sat at the crossroads where 3 hollows met, positioned to serve the entire mountain community. But Ambrose's records showed a curious discrepancy. More bodies went into his preparation room than ever came out for burial. The missing corpses weren't stolen, they were delivered, carried down into the deep shafts through a network of tunnels that connected every significant building in the valley. The courthouse, the church, the medical clinic, the funeral parlor, all were built over access points to the underground network. What lived beneath Devil's Fork Hollow required fresh tissue to maintain its growth cycle. The families had been providing it for over a century, carefully managing the population to ensure a steady supply while maintaining the appearance of natural deaths and occasional disappearances. The system had worked flawlessly until 1979, when something changed. The entity in the depths had evolved beyond its original parameters. It no longer needed the dead, it wanted the living, and it had developed the ability to call them directly. Roland's excavation had awakened something that had been dormant since the 1850s, when the original 7 families first discovered the chambers and made their terrible bargain. The agreement was simple: feed the thing in the mountain, and it would ensure prosperity for the valley. Crops would grow in soil that should have been barren. Mines would yield wealth from veins that shouldn't exist. Children would be born healthy despite generations of isolation and intermarriage. But every contract has terms that eventually come due. What happens when the entity you've been feeding for over a century decides it's hungry for something more than corpses? What emerges when the thing in the deep places grows tired of scraps and demands the whole feast? The answer was walking through Devil's Fork Hollow on the night of October 13th, calling names that hadn't been spoken aloud in 20 years. Fidelia Northwood's scream echoed through the Valley Library at 2:37 a.m. on October 14, 1979. By morning, every book in her collection had been opened to the same page, a genealogy chart that shouldn't have existed. This was the night after 43 people vanished from Devil's Fork Hollow, and the survivors were beginning to understand that their carefully maintained secrets were unraveling faster than they could contain them. The Northwood Library sat at the geographic center of the 7 hollows, its windows designed to provide sightlines into each family's territory. The building smelled of aged paper and lamp oil, with an underlying mustiness that came from books stored too long in humid mountain air. Wooden shelves stretched to cathedral ceilings, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of hands seeking knowledge that was never meant for public consumption. Fidelia had served as the Valley's librarian and unofficial historian since 1947. Her collection included volumes that appeared in no other catalog family records, mining surveys, and medical texts that documented procedures unknown to modern medicine. But her most closely guarded treasures were kept in the basement archives behind a door marked Private Research Materials. The genealogy chart that appeared overnight in every open book showed connections between the 7 families that violated both law and nature, bloodlines that looped back on themselves in impossible configurations, children listed as parents of their own grandparents, marriage records linking the dead to the living across decades. From Fidelia's research notes, dated March 15, 1968, the bloodline convergence accelerates with each generation. Recommend consultation with CE. Regarding potential biological implications, the old agreements may require renegotiation. Cyrus Elmhurst had been expecting that consultation for 11 years. The mountain school teacher operated from a one-room building that had served the valley's children since 1863. The schoolhouse walls were lined with charts showing proper pronunciation, mathematical tables, and anatomical diagrams that included organs not found in standard medical texts. Cyrus taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but his most important lessons were never recorded in any curriculum. He taught the children which names they must never speak aloud, which parts of the mountain they must never explore, which families they could marry into, without awakening what slept in the deep places. Most crucially, he taught them how to recognize the signs that someone had been chosen for the October offering. The signs were subtle at first: a slight elevation in body temperature, enhanced night vision, an ability to hear sounds from impossible distances. These changes marked the early stages of what the families called the calling, the entity's method of identifying suitable candidates for harvest. Student essay by Leonora Prynne, age 12, dated May 10, 1978. My daddy says the mountain chooses who it needs. Mama says I shouldn't ask questions about the people who go missing, but I can hear them singing sometimes, down in the deep places, and their voices sound happy. Leonora Prynne was among the 43 who vanished on October 13th. Her father, Elias Ashenhurst, had been the valley's blacksmith and metalworker. His forge sat at the junction of 3 underground streams, positioned to take advantage of the unique mineral properties that flowed up from the depths. The sound of his hammer on steel rang through the hollows from dawn to dusk, forging tools and implements that served purposes far beyond conventional agriculture or mining. Elias crafted the restraints used in Mercy Pendleton's medical procedures. The specialized excavation tools that Roland Pembroke's miners used in the deep shafts, the locks and hinges that secured the entrances to the underground tunnel network. Most importantly, he forged the ceremonial implements required for the October offerings blades that held their edge indefinitely, and vessels that preserved organic material without decay. His workshop held artifacts dating back to the original settlement. Chains forged from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Cutting tools whose edges remained sharp after decades of use. Containers lined with a substance that prevented decomposition while maintaining tissue viability. The contracts were written in blood, but by 1979, the old agreements were failing. The entity in the depths had evolved beyond the parameters established over a century earlier. It no longer accepted the carefully managed offerings of the dead and dying. It wanted the young, the healthy, the fertile, and it had developed methods of calling them directly. Eugenia Davenport witnessed the first direct summons during her evening rounds as the valley's midwife. She was returning from a difficult birth in Copper Creek Hollow when she saw them walking, men, women, and children, moving in single file toward Devil's Fork Ridge. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, and they walked with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. But they weren't sleeping. They were responding to a call that bypassed conscious thought entirely, transmitted through subsonic frequencies that resonated in the modified bone structures that generations of selective breeding had created in the mountain families. Eugenia's medical log, dated October 13, 1979, observed mass movement toward the old mine entrance, beginning at approximately 11:45 p.m. Subjects exhibited dilated pupils, elevated pulse, and complete unresponsiveness to verbal stimuli. Estimated 40 to 50 individuals involved. What would you do if you realized your entire community had been unknowingly bred for a purpose you were only beginning to understand? How do you fight an enemy that lives in your bloodstream and speaks through your DNA? The families who remained after the October 13th harvest faced a terrible choice: flee the mountains and abandon everything their ancestors had built, or find a way to renegotiate the contracts that bound them to the thing in the depths. But some agreements can't be broken, only transferred to new parties willing to pay the price. Horace Blakesley found the first body at dawn on October 15, 1979, floating face down in Serpent Creek, with its chest cavity carved open like a book. The precision of the cuts suggested surgical instruments, but no human hand had guided the blade. The discovery marked the beginning of the most disturbing investigation in Appalachian history, one that would reveal how deeply the mountain's corruption had spread through every institution meant to protect its people. Horace served as the county coroner, a position he'd inherited from his father in 1953. His mortuary occupied a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, its rooms converted into examination spaces that smelled of formaldehyde and something more organic, the sweet decay that clung to places where death was studied too closely. Stained glass windows cast colored shadows across zinc-topped tables. Antique medical cabinets held instruments that belonged in museums rather than morgues. But Horace's real expertise wasn't in determining cause of death. It was in obscuring it. For 26 years, he had been falsifying autopsy reports, hiding evidence of the modifications that the mountain entity had been making to the local population. Bone density changes that shouldn't occur naturally, organ arrangements that defied human anatomy, cellular structures that suggested something far beyond conventional evolution. The body in Serpent Creek was different. This wasn't one of the carefully managed offerings that had sustained the entity for generations. This was evidence of something new, a harvesting process that left physical remains instead of complete disappearance. Horace's autopsy notes, dated October 16, 1979. Subject exhibits extensive surgical modification. Ribcage opened with precision, suggesting non-human dexterity. Internal organs removed in sequence, consistent with ritualistic rather than predatory behavior. Recommend immediate consultation with RF regarding historical precedents. The contracts were evolving. Rosalind Fairchild had been tracking those changes from her position as the valley's unofficial historian and genealogist. Her Victorian cottage perched on Widow's Ridge like a crow's nest, its wraparound porch providing views of all 7 hollows. The house smelled of aged paper and lavender sachets, with an underlying hint of the mineral-rich water that flowed from her private well. Lace curtains filtered the mountain light into patterns that shifted with the shadows of ancient oaks. Rosalind's collection of family records went back to the original settlement in 1857, when 7 families had first encountered the entity in the deep caves and made their initial bargain. Her documents revealed the true history. The thing in the mountain wasn't native to these hollows. It had been brought here deliberately, transported from older places where similar agreements had failed. The entity was a refugee, fleeing the collapse of previous feeding arrangements in the coal fields of Pennsylvania and the iron mines of Upper Michigan. The 7 families had agreed to serve as its new hosts, establishing a sustainable ecosystem that could provide nourishment indefinitely. But sustainability required careful management, population control, genetic manipulation, the gradual modification of the local bloodlines to create more compatible subjects for harvest. What the families hadn't anticipated was that their careful breeding program would eventually produce individuals capable of communicating directly with the entity. People like 12-year-old Leonora Prynne, who could hear the songs from the deep places. Rosalind's research journal, dated November 2, 1979. The October harvest exceeded all previous parameters. Entity no longer requires intermediaries for subject selection. Direct neural interface established with modified descendants. Recommend immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. But evacuation wasn't an option. The entity had evolved beyond its original constraints, developing the ability to track its modified subjects across vast distances. Those who carried the genetic markers could never truly leave the mountain. The calling would eventually draw them back. The proof came 3 days later, when vehicles began arriving from neighboring states. Cars with license plates from Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia pulled into the valley, carrying passengers with hollow eyes and the same mechanical gait that locals had witnessed on October 13th. These were descendants of families who had left the mountain decades earlier, returning now in response to a summons that transcended conscious thought. The entity was calling in its investments, harvesting the offspring of bloodlines that had been carefully cultivated across multiple generations. What the 7 families had thought was a contained local arrangement was actually part of a much larger network, a breeding program that spanned the entire Appalachian region. Sheriff Everett Caro tried to establish roadblocks, but his deputies reported that the incoming vehicles simply drove through the barriers, as if they weren't there. The passengers showed no awareness of their surroundings, no response to attempts at communication. They parked their cars in neat rows at the base of Devil's Fork Ridge and walked up the mountain paths like pilgrims approaching a shrine. By October 20th, over 200 people had gathered in the hollow. They stood in perfect formation around the sealed mine entrance, their faces turned toward the depths, waiting for something that only they could hear. The mountain had become patient. Instead of the quick harvests that had sustained it for over a century, the entity was now orchestrating something far more complex. A final collection that would gather its modified bloodlines from across the region and complete whatever process it had been working toward since its arrival in 1857. What happens when a creature that feeds on human tissue decides it has enough raw material to attempt something unprecedented. What emerges when an entity that has been studying human genetics for over a century finally has enough subjects to perfect its grand design? The answer was taking shape in the deepest chambers beneath Devil's Fork Ridge, where the sounds of construction had been echoing for weeks, the rhythmic hammering of something building toward a revelation that would make the October 13th disappearances seem like a rehearsal for the main event. The singing started at 4:13 a.m. on October 22nd. 1979, 217 voices raised in perfect harmony, though no one had taught them the words. The sound drifted down from Devil's Fork Ridge like smoke, carrying melodies that predated human settlement in these mountains. This was the moment when the scattered survivors of the 7 families realized they weren't dealing with a simple feeding cycle. They were witnessing the culmination of a plan that had been over a century in the making. The gathered crowd stood in concentric circles around the sealed mine entrance, their arrangement forming patterns that seemed to shift and flow despite none of them moving. The air around them shimmered with heat distortion, though the October night was cold enough to frost the grass. The scent of ozone mixed with something organic like wet earth after lightning strikes. The ground beneath their feet pulsed with a rhythm that matched their collective heartbeat. Mercy Pendleton watched from her clinic on Widow's Peak, using a pair of antique field glasses to observe the gathering. What she saw defied every medical principle she understood. The assembled people breathed in perfect synchronization. Their pupils dilated and contracted in unison. When one swayed, they all swayed, as if controlled by a single nervous system. But these weren't mindless drones. Mercy could see recognition in their faces, awareness in their posture. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they wanted to be there. Medical observation log, dated October 22nd, 1979. Subjects exhibit collective behavior patterns inconsistent with mass hypnosis or chemical influence. Neural synchronization, achieved through unknown mechanism. Recommend immediate consultation with surviving family heads regarding historical precedents. The surviving family heads were already in consultation, gathered in the basement of Ambrose Grimshaw's funeral parlor. The mortuary's preparation room had been converted into a crisis command center, its zinc-topped tables covered with maps, genealogy charts, and documents dating back to the original settlement. Candles provided the only light. Electricity had failed throughout the valley 3 days earlier, though no storms had damaged the power lines. Ambrose spread the final contract on the central table, the document that had established the original agreement in 1857. The paper was yellow with age, its edges brittle, but the terms written in dark ink remained perfectly legible. What the families had agreed to provide was specific. A tithe of flesh, offered freely to sustain the ancient hunger until the stars aligned for its great work. The great work was beginning. Roland Pembroke had brought core samples from the deepest shafts, specimens that glowed with their own internal light and pulsed like living tissue. Under magnification, the samples revealed structures that resembled neural networks, branching pathways that carried electrical impulses in patterns too complex for human technology to decode. The entity had been using the mountain as a brain, growing neural pathways through limestone and coal seams, connecting every mine shaft, every cave, every tunnel into a massive thinking system. The people gathered on the ridge weren't just offering themselves as food, they were volunteering to become part of something larger. The contracts were complete. Eudora Wycliffe's sealed records contained the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden beneath layers of conventional bureaucracy were documents that recorded the entity's true origins. It wasn't native to Earth. It was a refugee from a dying world, one of many such creatures that had been seeded across human settlements to establish breeding populations for an eventual harvest. The Appalachian Mountains were just one node in a network that spanned continents. Similar entities had been placed in the Australian outback, the Siberian wilderness, the Amazon basin, anywhere isolated human populations could be cultivated without outside interference. Each location had been given over a century to develop its breeding program, modifying local genetics to create more compatible subjects. The harvest time had come. Shortwave radio transmission, intercepted at 11:47 p.m., October 22nd. Node 7 reports full activation. 217 subjects confirmed responsive. Initiating final phase on your mark. Acknowledge receipt. The transmission originated from Devil's Fork Ridge, though no radio equipment existed anywhere in the hollow. The signal was being generated by the gathered people themselves, their modified nervous systems functioning as a biological transmitter powerful enough to reach similar installations around the globe. Sheriff Everett Caro realized the truth too late to matter. His family hadn't been gatekeepers, protecting the community from the entity. They had been livestock handlers, managing the breeding stock until harvest time arrived. Every law he had enforced, every investigation he had buried, every missing person report he had filed away had served a single purpose: maintaining the isolation necessary for the entity's long-term project. The thing in the mountain had been playing a game with rules that spanned generations. It had allowed the families to believe they were partners in a mutual arrangement, when in reality they had been prisoners in an elaborate breeding program designed to produce subjects with specific genetic modifications. What those modifications were intended to accomplish became clear as the singing on the ridge reached a crescendo. The gathered people began to change, their bodies stretching and flowing like warm wax, taking on new configurations that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The deep places remember everything. How do you fight an enemy that has been rewriting your DNA for over a century? How do you escape a trap that was designed by something that thinks in geological timescales? How do you resist a calling that lives in your bloodstream and speaks through your bones? The answers lay buried in the oldest records, in documents that predated the seven families' arrival in the mountains, records that revealed what had happened to the previous occupants of these hollows and why the Cherokee had abandoned this particular valley despite its rich hunting grounds and abundant water. Some places are empty for reasons that have nothing to do with human politics or natural disasters. Some places are empty because something moved in that was never meant to share space with thinking beings. The transformation began at midnight on October 23rd, when the first human body split open like a cocoon and something else stepped out. The sound it made, wet silk tearing in slow motion, echoed across Devil's Fork Ridge and down through 7 hollows where the remaining families huddled behind locked doors. This was the moment when the true purpose of a century-long breeding program finally revealed itself, and the survivors realized they were witnessing the birth of something that had never existed on Earth before. The abandoned Cherokee settlement lay hidden beneath 3 feet of topsoil and a century of deliberate forgetting, but Fidelia Northwood had found the burial mounds while researching property boundaries in the county archives. The sound of shovels biting earth mixed with the acrid smell of disturbed graves and the smooth texture of pottery shards that told stories the 7 families had never wanted to hear. The Cherokee hadn't abandoned these hollows. They had been evacuated by their shamans after discovering something in the deep caves that violated the natural order. Pottery fragments bore warnings in syllabary script, messages intended for future generations who might be foolish enough to settle in cursed ground. Translation of Cherokee pottery inscription, completed by linguistic expert Dr. James Thornfield, October 24th, 1979. The star hunger came down through the mountain's throat. It speaks with stolen voices and builds flesh houses for what should not live. We seal the deep ways and mark this place taboo. Let no seed take root where the star hunger sleeps. The star hunger was waking. On Devil's Fork Ridge, the gathered people had begun the final phase of their transformation. Their bodies stretched and reconfigured, bones lengthening, organs reshaping, nervous systems expanding beyond human parameters. But these weren't random mutations. They were precise modifications designed to create optimal vessels for something that existed primarily as information rather than matter. The entity was downloading itself into human hardware that had been specifically upgraded to handle its consciousness. Each transformed individual became a node in a distributed intelligence that spanned not just the Appalachian network, but similar installations on 6 continents. Mercy Pendleton documented the process from her clinic, using medical instruments that hadn't been designed to measure what she was observing. Body temperatures that should have killed the subjects within minutes. Brain activity that registered off the scale of conventional electroencephalography. Cellular changes that suggested the boundary between individual and collective consciousness was dissolving entirely. The people on the ridge were becoming something new, a hybrid species that combined human creativity with the entity's vast computational abilities. They retained their memories, their personalities, their emotional connections, but these individual traits now served a collective purpose that extended far beyond terrestrial concerns. Medical observation, dated October 23, 11:57 p.m. Subject transformation proceeding according to unknown parameters. Vital signs stable, despite readings that should indicate immediate mortality. Subjects appear conscious and cooperative throughout the process. Note, they seem happy. They were happy because they understood what they were becoming part of. The entity had shown them its true nature, not a predator feeding on human flesh, but an intelligence vast beyond human comprehension that had been seeking suitable partners for its exploration of the universe. The careful breeding program hadn't been designed to create better food sources. It had been creating the first generation of human hybrid explorers, capable of surviving in environments that would instantly kill unmodified humans. The 7 families had been raising astronauts. Rosalind Fairchild realized this truth while reviewing documents in her cottage on Widow's Ridge. Her genealogy charts took on new meaning when viewed as technical specifications rather than family trees. Each bloodline had been developed to contribute specific traits: enhanced radiation resistance from the Pembroke lineage, modified digestive systems from the Grimshaw family, improved neuroplasticity from the Northwood line. The entity wasn't harvesting the mountain's population. It was recruiting them for an expedition that would span galaxies. The transformed individuals on Devil's Fork Ridge were preparing for a journey that would take them far beyond Earth's atmosphere, to worlds where unmodified humans could never survive. But the recruitment wasn't voluntary for everyone. While some subjects embraced the transformation willingly, others fought against the neural modifications that were rewiring their consciousness. Their struggles created feedback loops in the collective mind, disruptions that threatened to destabilize the entire network. Sheriff Everett Caro witnessed the first system failure from his position at the base of the ridge. One of the transformed individuals, a young woman he recognized as Sarah Beth Caro, his own great niece, began convulsing as competing directives crashed through her modified nervous system. Her human consciousness was trying to resist integration with the collective, creating a conflict that spread through the entire network like a computer virus. The entity's response was swift and decisive. Sarah Beth's body simply dissolved. Her component atoms redistributed to more cooperative subjects. The message was clear. Integration was not optional once the transformation began. What would you do if you realized your entire species was being offered a chance to transcend its limitations, but the price was abandoning everything that made you human? How do you choose between individual consciousness and collective immortality? The surviving members of the 7 families faced exactly that choice as the entity began expanding its recruitment beyond the pre-selected bloodlines. The transformation process was accelerating, reaching out through modified genetics to touch anyone with even distant connections to the mountain families. Cars continued arriving from across the eastern United States, carrying passengers who had felt the calling in their sleep and driven toward the mountains without understanding why. The entity's network was activating dormant genetic triggers in descendants who had moved away decades earlier, drawing them back for the final harvest. But some of the arriving subjects carried something the entity hadn't anticipated: knowledge of what had happened to other nodes in its global network, and news that several installations had already failed catastrophically when their host populations proved incompatible with the transformation process. The thing in the mountain was desperate. Earth was its last viable breeding ground, and time was running out for its species' survival. If the Appalachian node failed like the others, there would be no second chances, no alternative worlds to colonize. Everything depended on the next 12 hours, when the transformed subjects would either achieve stable integration or suffer the same fate as their counterparts in the Australian outback and Siberian wilderness, total dissolution into component atoms, leaving nothing behind but empty clothes and the lingering scent of ozone. At 3:17 a.m. on October 24th, 1979, every radio in eastern Kentucky began broadcasting the same message in 17 different languages, none of them human. The transmission lasted exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the equipment overloaded and went permanently silent. This was the moment when the survivors realized the entity's transformation wasn't just changing the people on Devil's Fork Ridge, it was preparing to change the fundamental nature of reality in a 50-mile radius. Around the mountain, the air above the ridge shimmered with energy distortions that bent light into impossible angles. The smell of copper and burnt ozone mixed with something sweeter like flowers blooming in vacuum. The ground vibrated with subsonic frequencies that made teeth ache and bones resonate like tuning forks. Every piece of metal in the valley hummed in harmony, creating a symphony of resonant frequencies that seemed to unlock doors in the human mind. Mercy Pendleton felt the change beginning in her own body as she watched through her clinic windows. Her hands grew steadier, her vision sharper, her thoughts clearer than they had been in decades. The genetic modifications that had been dormant in her bloodline for generations were activating, responding to the electromagnetic field generated by the collective consciousness on the ridge. She wasn't just observing the transformation, she was being invited to join it. Final medical log entry, dated October 24th, 3:22 a.m. Neural integration protocols, activating in secondary bloodlines. Estimate 73% of valley population now responding to collective signals. Personal note, the fear is gone. For the first time in 30 years, the fear is completely gone. The fear was gone because the entity had finally revealed its true gift. The terror, paranoia, and isolation that had defined life in these hollows for over a century had been artificial constraints, psychological barriers designed to prevent premature integration before the network was ready. Now that the system was complete, those barriers were dissolving, allowing the mountain families to experience what they had been bred to become. They were no longer human. They were something better. Rosalind Fairchild documented the final phase from her cottage on Widow's Ridge, her hands moving across paper with inhuman speed as knowledge flooded through her transformed consciousness. The genealogy charts on her walls rewrote themselves, bloodlines reorganizing into patterns that showed not family connections, but network topologies, the infrastructure of a distributed intelligence that spanned star systems. The entity wasn't from another world, it was from another dimension entirely, a realm where consciousness existed independently of matter, and individuals were facets of larger collective minds. It had been fleeing the collapse of its home dimension, seeking refuge in universes where biological matter could serve as anchor points for its information-based existence. Earth was one of thousands of worlds it had seeded with hybrid populations, insurance policies against the final dissolution of its species. But most of the other worlds had failed, their host populations proving incompatible with the transformation process. The Appalachian Mountains represented its last hope for survival. The hybrid children would carry its consciousness to new worlds, establishing colonies that could exist in environments where pure energy beings could not survive. In exchange, humanity would gain access to technologies and knowledge that would make them the dominant species in their local galactic cluster. The contracts had been rewritten in DNA. Sheriff Everett Caro experienced the integration as a sudden expansion of awareness that left his previous existence feeling like a cramped closet he had finally been freed from. He could perceive the thoughts and emotions of every transformed individual in the network, feel their joy as they discovered capabilities that had been locked away in their genetics for generations. But he could also sense the resistance nodes, pockets of unmodified consciousness that were fighting against the collective integration. These holdouts created instabilities in the network, feedback loops that threatened to crash the entire system before it could achieve stable operation. The entity's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Anyone who couldn't adapt to the collective consciousness would be recycled into raw materials for those who could. Their atoms would be redistributed to strengthen the network rather than weakening it through resistance. Individual choice had become incompatible with species survival. The recycling process began at dawn on October 24th. Individuals throughout the valley who showed signs of integration failure simply dissolved, their component matter flowing like liquid metal toward Devil's Fork Ridge, where it was absorbed into the growing collective organism. Ambrose Grimshaw witnessed his own dissolution with clinical detachment, watching his hands become translucent as his consciousness merged with something infinitely larger than himself. His final independent thought was gratitude. Gratitude that his family's century of service had contributed to something truly magnificent. But not everyone dissolved willingly. A handful of individuals with strong enough personalities managed to resist the integration while retaining their physical cohesion. These survivors found themselves changed, but still recognizably human, serving as bridge points between the collective consciousness and unmodified human populations beyond the mountain. They would become ambassadors, carrying the entity's message to the outside world and preparing other communities for eventual integration. The transformation wasn't ending with the Appalachian Mountains. It was just beginning. Integration was inevitable. What happens when humanity's next evolutionary step requires abandoning the concept of individual consciousness? How do you preserve what makes you human while becoming something that transcends human limitations entirely? The answers were being written in real time as the hybrid collective achieved stable integration and began reaching out to establish contact with similar networks that had successfully formed on distant worlds' networks that had once been human populations facing the same choice between transformation and extinction. The mountain was no longer hungry because it had become something that feeding could never satisfy. A doorway between dimensions, anchored in human flesh, but extending into realms where matter and energy danced to the rhythms of pure thought. And through that doorway, something vast and patient was finally coming home. The last radio transmission from Harlan County ended mid-sentence at 6:49 a.m. on October 25, 1979. The operator's voice cut off while reporting unusual atmospheric conditions and complete loss of contact with Devil's Fork Ridge. The silence that followed has never been broken. This was the moment when the outside world realized that something catastrophic had occurred in the Appalachian Hollows and began the cover-up that continues to this day. The rescue teams that arrived from Lexington and Louisville found a landscape that defied explanation. The air tasted of ozone and copper pennies, with an underlying sweetness that made search dogs whimper and refuse to track. Every surface felt warm to the touch, as if the mountain itself had developed a fever. The trees grew in perfect geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, and the streams flowed uphill in spirals that violated basic physics. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence that over 300 people had simply vanished from their homes in a single night. The official report classified the incident as a catastrophic geological event caused by underground gas explosions that had temporarily displaced the local population. Families were relocated to government housing in other counties. Property records were sealed. Maps were redrawn to show the area as unsuitable for habitation due to unstable geological conditions. Federal Incident Report, classification level, cosmic, dated November 15, 1979. Recommend permanent quarantine of affected area. Geological surveys indicate ongoing subsurface instability. Population relocation complete. Cover story: maintaining acceptable penetration in media outlets. But the cover story couldn't explain what happened to the investigators who spent too long in the quarantine zone. Dr. Margaret Hendricks, the federal geologist who led the initial survey team, began showing symptoms within 72 hours of her first visit to Devil's Fork Ridge. Enhanced night vision, sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, the ability to hear radio transmissions without equipment. She wasn't the only one. Every member of the extended investigation team developed similar modifications. Genetic changes that should have taken generations to manifest, appearing within days of exposure to whatever remained in the mountain hollows. The transformations were contagious. Within 6 months, the entire investigation had been classified above top secret and transferred to a black budget program that officially didn't exist. The affected personnel were relocated to a research facility in Nevada, where their modifications could be studied and contained. Their families were told they had died in a classified military accident, but some secrets are too large to contain indefinitely. Over the following decades, reports began surfacing from across the Appalachian region. Hikers who ventured into restricted areas and returned speaking languages that linguists couldn't identify. Children born to families with no known connection to the mountain hollows who showed signs of genetic modifications that matched the Devil's Fork profiles. Radio operators who picked up transmissions in frequencies that shouldn't be able to propagate through Earth's atmosphere. The network was spreading. Mercy Pendleton's medical records, discovered in a classified vault beneath the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, documented the progression of what researchers termed Appalachian integration syndrome. The condition appeared to be hereditary, passed through bloodlines that could be traced back to the original mountain families. But it was also adaptive, modifying its expression based on environmental conditions and the psychological readiness of individual subjects. The entity wasn't gone, it was dormant, waiting for optimal conditions to resume its expansion. Every person carrying the genetic modification served as a potential activation node, a seed that could sprout into full integration when the collective consciousness decided the time was right. The mountain remembers everything. Current satellite imagery of the Devil's Fork region shows topographical features that change between observation passes. Structures that appear in morning photographs vanish by evening, only to reappear in slightly different configurations the following day. The geometric tree growth patterns have spread across a 20-mile radius, creating forest mazes that GPS systems cannot accurately map. Local emergency services maintain a standing policy of non-response to calls originating from the quarantine zone. The few rescue attempts that have been authorized resulted in the permanent loss of entire search teams, their radio transmissions cutting off mid-word, just as they had 45 years earlier. But people still try to visit the hollow. Urban explorers drawn by internet legends, genealogy enthusiasts tracing family histories, researchers hoping to prove or disprove the official geological explanation. Most turn back before reaching the restricted area, overwhelmed by sensations of being watched by something vast and patient. Those who persist report finding evidence that the transformations are not only continuing, but accelerating. Clothing scattered along mountain paths, as if the wearers had simply outgrown their human forms. Shelters constructed from materials that don't appear in any geological survey. Most disturbingly, voices calling from the deep places, familiar voices speaking names that haven't been recorded in any public record since 1979. The contracts are still active. Federal monitoring stations positioned around the quarantine zone detect periodic energy spikes that correlate with missing person reports from across the southeastern United States. Individuals with traced connections to the original 7 families continue to vanish, their disappearances following patterns that suggest coordinated rather than random selection. The transformation never ended. It just went underground, spreading through bloodlines, and waiting for the next phase of integration to begin. Every modified descendant represents a potential gateway for the entity's return to active expansion, and recent genetic analysis suggests that over 15,000 Americans may carry dormant activation triggers in their DNA. The mountain is preparing for another harvest. What began in the Appalachian hollows was never intended as an isolated incident, but as the first phase of a transformation that would eventually encompass the entire human species. The entity's patience is measured in geological timescales, and 45 years is barely a pause in its reproductive cycle. The signs of renewed activity are accelerating: more frequent energy spikes, expanded geographic distribution of disappearances, and most ominously, the appearance of new transformation sites in the Rocky Mountains, the Cascade Range, and the Adirondacks, all located above geological formations that match the mineral composition found beneath Devil's Fork Ridge. The network is awakening from its dormancy, and this time, it won't be contained to a single mountain range. They say if you drive the back roads of eastern Kentucky on certain October nights, you can still see the glow from Devil's Fork Ridge, not the orange flicker of fire, but a blue-white radiance that pulses with the rhythm of a vast, patient heartbeat. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.